Hey there, Joe DiSanto here. Thanks for joining me in another video. I'm going to talk a little bit about the emergency fund and when are examples of situations where it makes sense to use the emergency fund. Well, obviously, you would certainly use your emergency fund in an emergency. I think generally the emergency fund is probably most thought of in the case that you lose your job for an extended period of time and you have cash there to pay your basic living expenses and housing and keep up with your mortgage without going into some other form of debt. So, that's probably the primary scenario. However, I think you can use your emergency fund for really unexpected large expenses. So if you own a house and you have an unexpected very large home repair, you might dig into your emergency fund for that. If you have medical expenses that your health insurance does not cover, so big out-of-pocket expense, you might use your emergency fund for that. Perhaps you need to help out a family member or parent or something like that. Obviously, that's, you want to do your best to help your family, but you also need to protect your own needs as well. But that might be a circumstance for sure. Now, I think that's all pretty obvious, so I'm going to talk a little bit about other circumstances surrounding the emergency fund. Now, I think the emergency fund should be probably superseded by high interest credit card debt. And the reason I say that is because it's good to have the emergency fund, sure, but if you have $30,000 in an emergency fund and $30,000 of credit card debt charging you 20% interest per year, having that emergency fund is very expensive, of course. At 20% of $30,000, it's $6,000 cost on the credit card debt to maintain the emergency fund. And then, of course, the interest over 5 years would eat up the emergency fund. So my thinking is a lot of what expenses would come in an emergency can be paid for on a credit card. So why not take the emergency fund, pay off the credit card, and then hold the credit card, do not use it, and have that be your emergency fund. Is it as good as having cash? No. But if you're carrying a balance on the card whilst you have the fund, they sort of cancel each other out. So I would consider paying down high interest credit card debt before putting together an emergency fund, as long as you have the credit available. Another question is should I pay off student loans or car loans or things like that with the emergency fund? I wouldn't, worry about paying off your mortgage first, or your student loans. Usually those are the lowest interest debt, and oftentimes the interest is tax deductible. Perhaps you would pay off your car loan. Maybe you would do a split thing where you'd build up your emergency fund, but if you were going to put, $300 a month in an emergency fund, you might consider taking half of that money, paying off the car faster, and only putting half in an emergency fund. Because car interest is not deductible, and oftentimes your car loan interest can be higher. If the car loan no interest is low, I'd probably prioritize the emergency fund. The last thing I want to kind of talk about is it better to have an emergency fund in cash or take the emergency fund and invest the money? Well, the emergency fund is obviously meant to be there in the emergency, so you potentially would need the money at any given time. Usually you wouldn't invest that kind of money, but certainly you would want to have that money getting interest. And nowadays, at least right now with interest rates, you can get 3, 4, even 5% sometimes in a savings account. So you definitely want to have the emergency fund in some sort of high yield savings account. Now, could you have the emergency fund invested more for the long term, hoping for a larger gain on it? I think you could. Again, if you have some sort of credit available, particularly lower interest credit, like a home equity line of credit, if it were me, I would invest the emergency fund in a longer term profile with the hope of getting 7 to 10% return, and with the idea that in the emergency I might use the HELOC at first and then slowly divest the emergency fund and pay off the HELOC, within a certain time period. But to have 3 to 6 months of expenses, which could be a lot of money uninvested, and that potentially you don't even run into an emergency, I think it's better in that case if you have just the cash to go invest it and kind of roll the dice, so to speak. So outside of emergencies, those are 3 circumstances where you might alter the way you look at the emergency fund. Hope that was helpful. See you in the next video.